What's up, Broncos country? Welcome back to the Broncos Podcast Network and YouTube for the latest episode of Broncos Now. As always, I'm your host, Sydney Jones, and coming up on today's episode, we'll hear from head coach Sean Payton and general manager George Paton as they met the media for their pre-draft press conference. All that and more coming up on today's episode. With the NFL draft just 1 week away, head coach Sean Payton and general manager George Paton met with the media today for their annual pre-draft press conference. George Paton opened it up today by giving an update on where the team stands on their draft prep.
We've been busy in meetings, just broke 3 weeks of draft meetings. I've been really impressed how the draft meetings have gone and really the entire draft process. Just the communication, the collaboration with coaches, scouts, really the entire organization. We've had a lot going on. A lot of players coming and going, so it's been all hands on deck, and it's been really impressive. Just in regards to the draft, we feel good with where we're at. We have 8 picks. We have the 12th pick in the draft. One thing we know, we're going to get a really good player at 12. We've had teams call to move up. We've had teams call to move back. We have flexibility, but we do know at 12, if we stand pat, we're going to get a really good player.
Both Sean Payton and George Paton discussed the potential of moving up in the draft and what their philosophy is on trading future first-round picks.
The hypothetical relative to what the compensation is it's a lot of times driven by who else is interested. So is George, and he's talked to all these teams in front of us, and obviously depending on how much further you go up, and then it's also if there's someone else doing the same thing, and so that, I think George said it best at the very beginning, that certainly is a possibility, and then it's how much you can pallet.
Yeah, I would just say if it's a player you think can change the landscape of your organization moving forward, like a quarterback, then you do whatever you take to get him. And if there's a consensus in the building, a love in the building, you're aggressive and you try to get him. Doesn't mean you're going to get him, but you try. And so we're open to everything. We're wide open.
Sean and George were also asked about their communication throughout the draft process and how they stay focused on their vision.
You know, when we have a difference of opinion, whether it's Sean, myself and another coach, we just watch. We just get more information, gather more information. Typically, that involves watching more tape together. We have group studies going on throughout our building right now for these clusters that I talked about to try to break a tie. We have I would say it rarely gets to draft day. These discussions, we've had so many discussions. We spent so many hours in our draft room that we've had most of these discussions. Our board will have been set, so that rarely comes up in my 20-something years.
We have fun debate. Like we're playing around. I mean, today there's call it 3 segments in each round, and there's a group of players within that framework, and we're discussing, the middle of the 4th, let's say, these 6 players do we see, and it's not like without disagreement sometimes. I mean, he and I on one position group have a haircut wagered on who goes first. But they're right there. And so it's man, this is the time. This process, it's interesting because I think I really like, we go through the 2 weeks of readings with the scouts and the coaches, and then there's another week and a half where we're doing exactly what George said. We're taking a segment later today. We'll be later, let's say later in this draft, and a lot of times when the draft ends and you're signing free agents, they may be players that might be on your 6th round stack or your 7th round stack, and then really trying to order those relative to the funds you have after the draft to pay them and prioritize, and so, I in my time, I would agree with George. I can't ever recall like one of those on draft day. I mean, it would be during the process where then you'd get more film out and you're like, there's no way, or, so.
And in other news, the Broncos offseason program began on Monday, and Sean Payton talked about what his message was to the players.
Man, the turnout was great. We're probably, I'd say 98% in the 2 or 3 individuals that weren't here. I've just talked with all of them. And I think the one thing, and this is a credit to Bo and a lot of people, really, the people all involved in the weight room and the athletic training room, the people that are treating our players. You know, we had a big goal of, like, how do we reduce the injuries? I mean, shoot, the first training camp I had with you guys, we had someone get hurt, and it was like, man, here it goes again. And I was like, I don't know that it's ever happened before, but we went from 32nd in the league to games missed by players on your roster to first in the league by fewest. So we went from 100 and some to 30 some in 1 year. And I think the simple message on Monday was, that's what we're doing right now. You know, it's not football right now. We're getting our bodies. And look, we're in the business of selling. You know, it's optional to be here. I think the player today wants to be somewhere where they feel like, man, they are getting a real good workout. They're getting the food, and all the things that go into it, the recovery, if it's a player who's coming off an injury. They want to feel like they're getting that. And compared to maybe where they do it in the offseason, if they feel like where they're coming from is accomplishing more than when they get here, then that's not good. And so the purpose for that message with me was, hey, we're heading the right direction here. Like, look, our job is to maximize your earning potential, win games, and the first step in doing that is keeping you healthy. And so that dramatic of a turnaround in 1 year, there's a ton of people that get credit for that. And so it began, but I don't want them, when they pull into the parking lot, feeling like they're coming to practice. You know, it's April. I want them to feel like they're coming to get in shape and to take care of their bodies, and that part of it's been good.
Now joining me here inside the Broncos podcast studio is Broncos lead writer Eric Zalala. Eric, thanks for joining me. Finally, we got some new stuff to talk about here.
That's right, Sid. The always eventful pre-draft press conference is in the books, and we're just a week away from the draft.
I know, it's crazy. Obviously, no specifics were shared during the pre-draft press conference, but it was still nice to hear from head coach Sean Payton and general manager George Paton. Eric, what were some of your biggest takeaways?
Yeah, well, they talked a little bit about the quarterback position, obviously. There were quite a few questions about that position. Yeah. It's probably the biggest storyline around this team right now is what is this team going to do in the draft at the quarterback position? Are they going to get somebody at 12? Are they going to trade up to get somebody? Are they going to wait till later in the draft and use the 12th pick or whatever pick for somebody, you know, at another spot to kind of beef up this roster? That's the big conversation around this team. And I think what we heard from them on Thursday was similar to what we heard at the NFL annual meeting, which is that, first of all, a move up the board is on the table. Yep. They talked a little bit more in depth about that option, just in terms of George Paton saying, he was asked, you know, is it tough to palate or to stomach giving up more first-round picks after you haven't had them the last 2 years? And he said, listen, if that player is a franchise-changing player and is going to change the landscape of your franchise, you do whatever it takes to go get that guy. And so, you know, you don't know what the cost is going to be yet. Sean Payton talked about it's all hypothetical at this point. You look at some recent deals to see what it might cost to go up the board, and you figure out what's palatable for you to do. But it was interesting to hear George Paton say, you know, if it's that guy and there's a consensus and people love him in the building, then you go get that guy. And so that was definitely a main takeaway.
For sure.
I think the other takeaway from a quarterback position is that there's 7 to 8 guys that they like, that they've talked to. He didn't reveal exactly where he has those guys ranked, obviously, but the option seems possible for the Broncos also to take a quarterback later in the draft if they don't love one in round 1, if they don't feel like they want to go up and get somebody, if they don't feel like whoever's available at 12 still is kind of the right player for that pick. So that was interesting from a quarterback perspective. And then they're also kind of from a broader standpoint happy to just stay put at 12, and they're going to get a really good player there if they end up staying at 12, in part, Sid, because there's going to be a run, it feels like, on quarterbacks early in the draft, on offensive skill position players, a lot of receivers that are being mentioned. And so, you know, you've heard the Chargers talk about the 5th pick kind of being like the first pick in the draft. It's possible a defensive player doesn't come off the board until 7th or 8th.
Right.
This isn't necessarily what George Paton talked about, but just kind of general knowledge of what's going on. But there's a chance with the 12th pick you could get a really good football player, one of the top defenders, a top tackle. There's some good options there if you stay at 12. But what George Paton did recognize is we've got to hit on this pick, no matter who it is, no matter what position. He mentioned quarterback, tackle, and wide receiver. I think those are probably just the first three positions as you go down a list on offense rather than specifics, but always worth noting this time of year when people do list specifics, what they say. So he mentioned those three spots. But, yeah, it's important to get an impact player because you take a quarterback, it's got to be the right guy. You don't want to set yourself back, make the wrong choice, as George Paton said. If you don't take a quarterback, you've got to make sure that whoever that player is a cornerstone of your football team so that you keep getting better.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting. I think it was Sean who said this, that George has talked to every single team ahead of the Broncos in the draft. And George even said that he's had teams call him to move up and different teams have called him to move back too. So those things are already in the works. Yeah,
definitely. Certainly you'd expect them to do their homework, right? And I'm sure that that's what this is, just seeing, hey, right now, what is it going to cost to move up? What would we get if we move back a little bit? We've talked a lot about Sean Payton's had a history of trading up. George Paton has largely had a history of trading back. So just figuring out those two options, what does that look like for this team? Especially, I would say, if you like a quarterback that you think is going to be available a little bit later, does that mean you're more open to trading down? We'll have to see kind of how that all plays out. But they're definitely getting that intel. You hear around the league typically that some of those conversations, they happen a little bit and then they start to heat up around this time, a week before the draft. And so I'd imagine those conversations with certain teams, we'll see if the Broncos are involved in any of those, but they get more and more serious here over the course of the next week, and we'll just have to keep our eyes peeled. Maybe you find out the Broncos, trade up really high in the week leading up to the draft. Maybe that happens draft day. Maybe they trade back draft day. Maybe they just stay put. Obviously, there's a lot of options here, and I think part of what makes Denver exciting for this is some teams, they're going offense or they're going defense or, Chicago, pretty much know what they're going to do at number one, right? The Broncos, there's so many different directions they can go. It makes things exciting, makes things interesting, and it means next week's going to be fun.
Yeah, it definitely is. I know there's a lot of variables that go into it, Eric, and I know George and Sean talked about the potential of trading future first-round picks, but realistically for this draft, what do you think it would take to really move up, depending on how much they move up?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and not trying to hedge here, but it depends. Who's left? Who are they trying to get? Are they trying to go up to 2? Are they trying to go up to 3, 4, 8? Like if a quarterback is there at 7 or 8, it's obviously less expensive than going up to 3 or 4 would be. But there's probably a world where if maybe getting up to 4, if there's a quarterback there that you alone want and another team isn't interested in trading up as well, maybe it costs less than if there's 2 teams or 3 teams all trying to get up there.
Yeah,
and so if you're, the 3rd pick with New England, or you're the 4th pick with Arizona, those teams are in a good spot because they can try to have teams play off each other in terms of what it would cost to get up there. And I think that's when you see the really big deals is when there's multiple teams interested. As Sean Payton said on Thursday, that's still hypothetical right now in terms of what that costs. Those things sometimes, again, they happen beforehand, and maybe it does kind of feel like pre-draft trades. Maybe those are, and this is kind of anecdotal just from what I've observed, like you see a little bit, maybe you see bigger deals then because someone's going all the way up to 1 or 2,
For sure.
I wonder, on draft day, you're making these quick moves, and I think it kind of depends who goes 2 to Washington, who goes 3 to New England. That will maybe set up like what happens at 4, or does a surprise player go at 2? That changes who could go at 3 and how much that could cost. So it's still very much a moving target, and that's why knowing what these deals have cost in the past can help you be ready when you're on the clock and you got to figure something out.
Going off of that too, I know Sean and George both talked about their communication throughout the draft process and throughout those different scenarios. I mean, they've talked about everything heading into the draft. So when it comes down to draft day, draft night, they already know what they're going to do.
Yeah, the one thing you figure out is, as George said, Sean might say occasionally, hey, I really want this guy. So you figure out a way to go get that player. And I would imagine that those conversations probably take place more in the later rounds just because if you're going to the first round and you know, hey, I really want this player, that's something you can figure out a little bit more ahead of time. It's when you're in, say it's round 3, right? And you're like, oh, we really want Riley Moss. Let's go get him. That's kind of a conversation you have on the fly.
Yeah.
But you're not sitting there debating, okay, do we take this guy or this guy? Because you've got them graded out. George Paton explained they have them all in clusters, tiers within the clusters, positional value in terms of, an edge rusher is worth a little bit more than maybe an inside linebacker. And then you look at, hey, who have we already taken in the draft? If you have a round 3 quarterback, but you've already taken a quarterback in round 1, maybe you're more likely to take let's say tackle in round 3. So those things all play into it. Those are all decisions that are made ahead of time. It's really a lot of the times just as simple as, do we want to stay put and pick, or do we want to pick up more assets and trade? That would probably be another thing to watch out for, is if the Broncos do trade up in the first round, does that make them more likely to trade back later in the draft to get some more picks?
Makes sense.
But a lot of that is just, it's figured out ahead of time. George Paton said they'll spend 4 hours talking about a group of players in round 5, and then you get to round 5 in the draft, and half those players are gone already. And so it just speaks to all the preparation. And this is a long process, obviously, and a lot of the attention, as they said, is on round 1. But it's going to be important for this team to hit on the later round picks as well. And I think that's where what you're talking about, Sid, with just being on the same page, making sure all that homework is done, that comes into play on day 2 and day 3, I would think.
Yeah, definitely. And, it's like you said, they're long meetings, months of meetings leading up to it. But I know Sean said, it's enjoyable for him. They even joked they have a little haircut wager of, I think it's a certain player going before another guy in the draft. So that'll be interesting. What do you think the haircut is?
I don't know. I hope it's not too bad.
I know. I hope not too.
But no, I think these guys, you can tell how much they love football and grinding the tape and evaluating players. And one thing that stood out to me was Sean was talking about evaluating quarterbacks, and you go and they say, drop your favorite play on this board and then tell me how you would call this in a game. And Sean was like, I just love hearing how they call it. And it's
that
like,
was interesting.
It's like a football savant type thing where you're just like so dialed into the nuance of how can one person call this play versus another. You can tell how much they love it, and it makes the work a little bit easier.
It does. Well, I know leaving that pre-draft press conference that I'm the most excited I've been in recent years for the draft. Obviously, of course, we have a first-round pick, but, it goes back to what Sean said. This year's draft is, I think, just more fun from a fan standpoint, too, just with, how many quarterbacks are in this draft and just the talent this year, I think. Yeah,
it's going to be – you're right. There's going to be excitement, I think, all the way 2 through, 10 or 11. If the Broncos, if they end up picking at 12, it'll be exciting to see who they pick. But I think – after the way they phrased things, both at annual meeting and here in this pre-draft press conference, I feel like we just got to be ready for anything, that they could trade up at any moment, go get any player, and it'll be exciting to see what happens.
Well, looking forward to it. We're only 1 week out, Eric.
Oh, my gosh.
I know, crazy to think about, but appreciate you joining the show.
You got it, Sid.
Well, that's going to do it for this week's episode of Broncos Now, Broncos Country. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll meet you right back here on the Broncos Podcast Network and YouTube next week following the draft. I'll see you all then.